Hello, everybody. My name is Caitlin Solandi, and today I will be presenting on the normalization of racism and how it affects the Black community. I decided to do this semester long research because I myself am a person of color. I am Black and Puerto Rican, and I've experienced many different types of racism coming from my old schools, my old jobs, and even people from opposing races or even within my own racial background and ethnic background. And because of this, I wanted to do more research to educate myself on this topic, as well as spread any awareness and education that I know to people that have these same ideologies that should not be normalized. So, topics that will be discussed today are the definition of racism, the broadness and different parameters surrounding racism, the perception of colorism, texturism, and harmful stereotypes against the Black community, the importance of addressing these issues, and the gaps of research that I found when researching the three topics that I just listed, how the Black community can combat these internalized racism, and the gaps of research and closing those gaps of research, and my work cited to finish this discussion up. So, what is racism? The dictionary definition of racism is a belief or doctrine that inherent differences among the various racial groups determining a cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior and has the right to dominate others, or that a particular racial group is inferior to others. I included this in the beginning of the discussion because it is shown that racism is a very narrow topic. However, it is understanding that because of the fact that this is such a narrow topic or narrow definition, people perceive racism to be one race against another. However, racism also can be found within its own racial group. For instance, racism can be found within a specific minority group. It is not just quote unquote superior races against inferior races. Racism can be associated with the most commonly discussed form of racism, which is institutionalized racism, or prejudice against minorities that are shown to be systematic or executed through government authority. This is shown within the workforce, school forces, or any other type of authority that the government controls. However, because of the fact that we have become more progressive as a society, these have been minimized to a certain extent. And because of that, more forms of racism that are actually more internalized within our racial group have been brought more to light. And the ones that I will be discussing today are colorism, texturism, and stereotyping. So the first topic I will be covering is colorism. So what is colorism and how did it originate? The definition of colorism is differential treatment based on skin color, especially favoritism towards those with a lighter skin tone, and mistreatment or exclusion of those with a darker skin tone, typically amongst those of the same racial group or ethnicity. So this has actually been around for many, many years, dating back to the times of Jim Crow and slavery, where slaves would have children with their slave masters, usually through force, and they would have children of lighter skin tones. And because of this, they would get more preferential treatment during those times of slavery when meanwhile, people with darker skin tones would get less preferential treatment. Also, during the times of Jim Crow, there were things like abolishing interracial marriage or even the one drop rule during the Jim Crow laws that proved that people with the lighter skin tones sometimes have preferential treatment, determining their blackness or not. This term was then later coined in 1982, so now favoritism and colorism are under the same umbrella term. So, how does colorism affect the Black community? So, because of the fact that colorism had been infiltrated in the Black community since the times of slavery, it has been manifested for years where people with lighter skin tone have more societal privilege. And this is harmful because it is understood or perceived that people with darker skin tones have less privilege, leading to an internal war amongst the Black community. To add, this is also negative because there are more stereotypes that are building in terms of lighter skin tones and darker skin tones, having different negative stereotypes towards them. From there are other ways that there are different stereotypes that are going amongst this type of form of racism. For instance, there are now things where, or stereotypes or notions where people are being discriminated against based on if they are Black enough to be deemed as Black or if they're too white to be deemed as white. And this is a term called Blackthink. This term is more prevalent now because it is understood that many people will deem a person not Black enough if they do not have Black dominant features or not as dominant features, which are shown with people with lighter skin tone or associated with people that have lighter skin tone, and they are deemed not Black enough. But on the opposite spectrum, there are people with like a lot of Black dominant features and a darker skin tone, and they are deemed to be too Black, and they are having animalistic type adjectives towards their appearance. With this also is associating the lack of role models or specific role models within this community. This is mostly shown within the Black women population, where less and less Black women are getting professional degrees. And because of that, there are less people that are willing to or wanting to get more professional degrees because of the fact there are not that many role models that are leading them in the right direction. To add to that, most of the Black women role models that people will see that have professional degrees and are successful are people of lighter skin tones. And even with that, there's surrounding controversy around them because of the fact, or usually because of the fact, that they are of the Black race. Next that I will be discussing is texturism. Now, what exactly is texturism? The literal definition is the preference of hair with smoother or looser texture and the discrimination against people with kinkier, coarser hair within the same race. This is a more newer term that was introduced during 2020 and 2021, closer to the times of COVID-19, and mostly when Black Lives Matter movement was at its peak between the 2000s and 2020s. When explaining the impacts of texturism, it is seen that people with more Afro-textured hair are deemed as more unprofessional or against beauty standards. And because of this, there are more negative associations with Black dominant features, as I explained earlier, and with people with more of these features having more negative stereotypes applied towards them. This is shown to be most harmful through the media. So there are people or there are women that would idolize people in commercials with hair that is not that Afro dominant or Black dominant. They're seen to be more pretty, as it would be. This is also shown in social media where people are deemed to be less pretty if they had more kinky and coily hair, and they would have negative comments and negative stereotypes thrown at them on social media. Because of this, many Black women and Black men reject their Blackness in its essence and have negative viewpoints on their Afro dominant features. Next, what I will be talking about is negative stereotypes. So, what are negative stereotypes within the Black community? There are so many stereotypes within the Black community that are stigmatized within the African American race as a whole. So, an example of such are the sexualization of Black women. So, as the media has gotten progressively more known, the hypersexualization of women has become on a larger scale where people want hourglass figures, and it is mostly seen within Black women. And with that, Black women have shown to be objects in that sense. There are also certain cases where things may look more suggestive. For instance, Black women, especially younger Black women and Black girls, are not allowed to wear specific things or wear specific colors like the color red because it seems more suggestive. Whereas people within opposing races would not have to deal with that type of stigmatism. Next is the unrealistic expectations held against Black men. And this is shown within the way that Black men have to carry themselves in everyday society. For instance, they can't be sensitive, they cannot cry, they can't show any display of vulnerable emotion, and they're expected to be extremely sexual so then they can be the natural providers of the household. However, this is a backhanded situation because then Black men are perceived to be lazy, unemotional, hypersexual, and all of these negative adjectives that were supposed to be enforced amongst them. With that comes the ideology that Black men uphold toxic masculinity, of which was also forced upon them. Next are the notions surrounding people with lighter skin tones and darker skin tones. People with lighter skin tones are deemed to be more privileged or having more privilege or being more self-absorbed, where people with darker skin tone have more animalistic, like I said, adjectives, more animalistic viewpoints. They are deemed not part of the beauty standard, of which makes it harder for people with lighter skin tones and darker skin tones to not have that internal war that has been going on for centuries. Next would be the people of color and the media that they are surrounded with. So, especially in modern day society, the Black population is mostly known for rap culture and culture that is not that positive in today's society. However, it is understood that Black culture also was surrounded with the making of jazz, blues, and other forms of music that has actually helped a lot of people. But because of the fact that it is more popular, it is shown that the African American race is associated with negative stereotypes and negative lifestyles that are not as positive or not as wanted or deemed okay and acceptable within today's society. Next is the ideology of whitewashing, where if someone exhibits their white counterparts, or a Black person exhibits their white counterparts, whether that is not having or not exhibiting African American vernacular English or specific terms that people of the African American race have adapted to, they're deemed to be white. Or if someone seems to be more educated or wanting a higher education and perceiving themselves to be in a more proper notion, they are also deemed to be white. Basically, anything that is not that positive or upholding the Black race is deemed to be white. This is harmful to today's society because there are not a lot of role models within today's society that have a African American background or a Black background. So as more and more people are trying to form success in ways that are actually helpful, they are deemed white. However, there are other races that view the Black race as lazy, hostile, and aggressive. So when having the term whitewashing be a thing, it makes it seem like we have to be put in that category that other opposing races have amongst us, or we would be deemed as exhibiting white behaviors. Lastly is unrealistic beauty standards, and that follows the texturism topic that I was discussing earlier, where people with black dominant features are having less, are not part of the beauty standard that consistently changes every day. Or if they have a black dominant figure, especially amongst black women, they have that unrealistic body standard that not a lot of women can achieve or will achieve unless there's specific surgical things done to them. So, some gaps that I found within this form of research and why is it important to address these topics. So, gaps that I found when it came to the term of colorism is that it is the hardest form of racism to combat. It is a wide thing that is shown in almost every minority group that is known or has been talked about. And because of the fact that colorism has been around and manifested for so long, there are so many negative stereotypes that are perpetuated within that term that it would take extended education amongst many generations and not just one to diminish this form of racism. So that means that it would have to go not just past the current generation that is standing, but generations past that and before that to combat this issue. Within the topic of texturism, this term is relatively new. It's only about 2.5, maybe 3 years old. So there's not much research that can be addressed from an educational view or perspective. So most of research that is done or most that has been discussed was mostly found within social media or just the media in general, of which does not hold lots of credibility as of yet. In terms of negative stereotypes, although there is much research and extensive research done within negative stereotypes, there is no true umbrella term that is used for this form of racism. So there is no true extended research that can be done on this broad topic. To add, there are too many stereotypes within the Black community to just reject that topic as a whole. So it needs to be addressed from the community as a whole, which means there's many generations that need to address all negative stereotypes, which would take years to come. Why is it important to address these gaps and how can they be addressed? So there is no direct answer when it comes to addressing these gaps or how to fix these gaps. But the best way that it can start being addressed is that because of the fact that this is generational trauma within the Black community, we can strive towards teaching younger generations as well as teaching older generations for true equality amongst the Black community as a general population, as the Black community as a whole. More research can be done with topics that are not as talked about in terms of stereotyping and texturism, understanding what that means and educating everyone on these topics so then it is more embraced rather than demeaned. Spreading awareness and self-education on these topics will really come a long way when it comes to understanding that racism is not just inferior races versus superior races, but also races in itself. And in this case, I was talking about the Black community as a whole and addressing what topics they face as a community. This is my works cited, and thank you so much for listening. I hope this was somewhat educational and impactful. And yes, if you have any questions, feel free to reply to them. And